Labai džiaugiuosi, kad čia esate. Džiaugiuosi, kad atėjote šį vakarą praleisti su mumis. Ir šiandien pradėsiu nuo 3 svarbių dalykų. Tai visų pirma, nuo to, kodėl mes čia susirinkom kalbėti apie universalų dizainą mokymuisi. Šita tema yra svarbi mums kaip organizacijai ir mes dar labiau džiaugiamės, kad jūs esate čia ir jums tai yra svarbu. Šiandien turėsime nuostabias viešnes, Jean ir Kate, kurios pasidalins savo ekspertizę ir įvairiais pavyzdžiais ir viskuo, kas liečia universalų dizainą mokymus, ir turėsim dar nuostabią panelinę diskusiją. Tai labai džiaugiuosi, kad mus remia JAV ambasada ir mes koja kojon žengiam tam, kad galėtume kalbėti apie šitus dalykus. Tai ačiū jums labai. Ir trečias dalykas, mes esame labai gražioje vietoje. Tai labai dėkoju Kazickų šeimos fondui, kad mes čia galime būti ir tiesiog šį vakarą praleisti kalbėdami apie tai, kas yra svarbu. Prieš pradedant, aš žinau, kad dauguma jau susijungėte, šiandien dalis pranešimo, dalis mūsų vakaro vyks anglų kalba. Tai norėčiau tada truputį dar papasakoti apie instrukciją. Žinau, kad daugumai esate jau susijungę į Zoom linką, kam reikėtų iš anglų kalbos vertimo į lietuvių kalbą. Galite pasijungti, duodami šį QR kodą. Žinau, kad jau dauguma per linkus susijungia. Kai kurie dar jungiasi, reikia prisijungti. Ir tada, tam, kad išgirstumėt vertimą, jums reikia nueiti Zoom programėlę, tiesiog More paspausti, Interpretation ir pasirinkti lietuvių kalbą. Tokiu būdu jūs galėsite vertimą iš anglų kalbos į lietuvių kalbą. Jeigu šitos opcijos nematote, gali būti, kad jums reikės atsinaujinti Zoom programėlę. Ar kažkokių gal klausimų šitą vietą kyla, ar viskas tvarkoja? Kaip suprantu, viskas tvarkoje. Tai nieko nelaukdami galėsime pradėti. Tai labai džiaugiuosi, kad šiandien galiu pristatyti mūsų viešnes. Jean and Kate, it's a pleasure to welcome you on board. Floor is yours.
Hello. Before we get started, I wanted to note that if you have a hard time seeing the screen or if you'd like to follow along in the slide deck, we do have a QR code here if you want to scan. It'll ask you to make a copy of the slide deck, and that way you'll be able to follow along in that way. If you cannot scan it from there, we also have an address you can go to. It's https://bit.ly/slide deck UDL. I'll give everyone just a minute to be able to do that. Okay, it looks like everyone. All right, well, hello there. My name is Kate Blanchard, and I taught elementary special education in Las Vegas for a few years before I became a teacher coach with Teach for America. First as a coach, and then I worked for Teach for America as both a manager and a designer, helping to oversee their univariability, UDL, and special education initiative. A few years ago, Jean and I left Teach for America to start our own organization, consulting with schools and organizations that were looking to develop universal design for learning further.
And as Kate mentioned, I'm Jean Pallister. I was a Teach for America participant, and then I taught in New York City public schools, elementary school special education for 7 years. Then joined staff with Teach for America, and I was a coach for new teachers for a few years. and then joined the national team where Kate and I led a lot of the development around UDL and special education for Teach for America core members in the U.S.
Sorry, did you turn down the microphone?
Is that working now?
I think so, yeah.
Okay, thank you. So here is our agenda for our presentation tonight. We'll start with a brief discussion about why UDL is important. You all are here, so you probably already believe it's important, but we like to start with this discussion, and particularly how the mindset of its importance can help you to implement it in the classroom. We'll briefly discuss what UDL is and how specific definitions can help us to implement it, and then discuss the UDL guidelines themselves, getting into a little experience activity and sharing examples related to that activity, and then walk through an extended 3-step process that we found teachers in our program really, they found it very helpful for them to start to implement UDL in their classrooms. And then we'll conclude with a discussion about how we sometimes, to implement UDL, need to unlearn our expectations around what the right way to learn is. We also want to note that some of the ways that we've designed this presentation incorporate UDL itself. So you could be thinking about, where do you see UDL coming to life in this presentation? Before we get started, we do want to invite you to think about how you learn best. A lot of the educators we've worked with in the United States have never been given the opportunity to really think about, what do I actually need to learn? And so we want to invite you to think about, what do you need to learn? Oftentimes, we as learners are used to acting or performing learning. What does it look like? How do I show that I'm learning well? And sometimes that doesn't always work for how we actually learn. So if you are someone that learns best by taking pencil and paper notes, I invite you to do that. If you are someone that learns best by typing notes and you want to take out your computer, I invite you to do that. If you are someone who learns best by just sitting and listening, or even closing your eyes and listening, I invite you to do that. Take note of what will actually help you learn rather than just looking like a good learner. And as long as it's not disrupting anyone else, we will assume that you are doing what you need to learn best. And to meet your own needs. Also, perhaps you're a teacher and you have just finished a very long day of teaching and are tired and you start to feel sleepy. It will benefit your learning to stand up and stand on the side of the room and then sit back down again. Whatever you need to learn, we invite you to do that. Along with that, Kate and I have sometimes presentation needs that allow us to present best. Sometimes we might be really consulting our notes to make sure we say exactly what we want to say. And other times we might move around. I'm someone that can get a little nervous and I feel safe standing by the slides, so I might stay here. Kate presents best when she can kind of move around a little bit, so you might see her moving. But we ask that just as we extend the trust to you, however you learn best, extend the trust to us that this is how we present best.
Just to get it a little slower and pause
Yes.
the interpretation. We definitely can. Before we get into the UDL guidelines and examples of how to implement UDL, let's actually briefly talk about why UDL is important, as we mentioned in the agenda. UDL is important for all learners because all learners have unique strengths, needs, and preferences as learners. And UDL also asks us to expect this variability as the norm, rather than expecting mostly normal learners and then some outliners. So instead of us saying, this whole group of kids are normal and this child is different, it's saying, no, all of these children are different from each other. Navigating this bulk of paper and the microphone at the same time, have patience with me. We should expect this variability to show up in 2 different ways. Person to person, so Jean is different from me, and I am different from you. In our learning strengths, our needs and preferences, they're unique, they're going to vary for every single person. And the other way that variability shows up is contextual. My learning strengths, needs, and preferences will vary depending on my context, my environment. Is it morning? Is it night? Am I tired? Am I hungry? Have I had a bad day? My mood, and so much more. All right, we're going to start with a story that we often tell. I know many of you, from what I understand, may have heard a version of this story, but we like to start with this to ground us all in the same idea And we know some of you may have heard this a long time ago, or may be new to you entirely. So we're gonna start with the year is 1952, and the US Air Force has rapidly improving airplane technology, but they're getting worse and worse results, including more and more crashes. They realize the problem is in the design of the cockpit, which too many pilots are struggling to fit into. They're hiring taller pilots, they're hiring wider pilots, and they can't fit into the cockpit in a way that will optimize their performance and save their life. So they hire a researcher to determine what would the average pilot look like so that they can build their cockpit to fit that pilot. And this research takes dimension across all of these 10 dimensions of size. And he's finding some variable results. He's having difficulty actually finding the average. He takes a very generous approach, this middle 30%. And before he reports his findings, sorry, my paper is flopping around here a little bit. There we go. Found that the average for that middle 30%, but before he hands that data over to the Air Force, he started to wonder how many pilots are average on all 10 dimensions of size. So if you haven't heard this story before, or if it's been a while, take a minute and try to guess for yourself, how many do you think fit the average on all 10 dimensions?
Do you mean the percentage?
Hmm?
Do you mean the percentage?
Yeah, how many would fit all of it? And what he found, we'll get there, it's a suspense, was 0. Out of 4,000 pilots, 0 fit that middle 30% for every single dimension of size. So if you try to design for the average pilot, there is no way to do it, and you designed a cockpit that's going to fit literally no one. And so what the Air Force did was that they banned the average. They demanded that the contractors who would build their planes from here on out had to build to the edges of the dimensions of size. Cockpits that would accommodate the very smallest pilot and the very largest pilot. And initially the contractors said no. They said it was going to be too expensive. They refused to do it. But when the Air Force refused to budge, the contractors gave in, and it led to innovations like the adjustable seat, which has now become so standardized that we have it in our cars and many other places. So why do we tell this story? It's about the Air Force, it's about size, it's not about education, but neuroscience tells us the same is true of all people as learners too, that there is no such thing as an average learner. And even more so, there's no such thing as an average learner in any of these dimensions. Even a student who is considered sort of in that middle 30% has unique strengths and weaknesses. But despite rapidly improving technologies and research about how humans learn, our classrooms, our curriculum, our lesson plans, they're still designed for this imaginary middle pool of students. So none of our students, literally none, have the access and the opportunities they need to fulfill their true potential. Because we know that when we design for the average, we design for no one. So we need to design our classrooms like those adjustable seats, with flexibility and with choice that allow our students to find their own just right pathway. And that's where UDL comes in.
So what is UDL and how do I do it? We understand that some or many of you may have already learned about UDL, maybe attempting to use UDL in your classroom. What we have found is that when we offer a specific definition to the teachers that we work with, it helps them to implement it. So we want to offer that specific definition to you. And so the definition we sometimes use to help teachers implement it is that UDL is an educational framework that seeks to remove barriers to rigorous learning by creating flexibility and choice, based on educational and neuroscience research. And it might be helpful to remember that universal design for learning is based on the architecture movement, universal design. And so, traditionally, an architect would be given a goal, like, is it not on? Is it on now? Thank you. Continue to remind me, I thought I'd make sure I got it on. An architect traditionally might say, okay, I need to build an art museum. How can I make the most beautiful, innovative art museum? And then immediately get to designing it, such as this image of the British Museum. Under universal design, an architect would say, okay, I need to build an art museum. And before starting to even imagine what it might look like, they first ask, who are all of the different people that are going to come to this museum, and what are their different needs? And then that would lead them to think about, what about someone with a wheelchair? What about someone with a cane or a walker? What about someone pushing a baby stroller? People who cannot access the art in a museum such as this one. And it would lead them to design perhaps a museum more like this one, which is the Guggenheim Art Museum in New York City, which is one big, long, beautiful ramp. Under this design, you don't have to add something on after the fact. You don't have to put a ramp over stairs. You don't have to design a side entrance for someone in a wheelchair. You don't have to sort of say, oh, this is the alternative entrance over here or the elevator. Everyone can access the art at the same time together.
And that same thought process is how we encourage educators to implement UDL. This is a 3-step process. We start with the goals. Then we think about how all students have unique learning needs and what barriers a traditional lesson might present, what sort of those proverbial staircases at a museum are in a curriculum, and then design the lesson in a way that provides choice and flexibility that remove those unnecessary barriers, that remove those staircases and provide an elevator or a ramp instead.
Is your mic on? Just a short notice, can your microphone's on, always on.
Yep.
Thank you.
So first, we start by getting really clear, like really clear on that learning goal. Let's say your learning goal is to solve problems, math word problems specifically, involving addition and subtraction. Understanding the real life scenario, determining whether a student needs to use addition or subtraction, and then having that student accurately solve the problem. So we're clear on what the goal is, and now we move to the second step, which is to consider all of the students who will be attempting that goal and what barriers might exist that are not directly related to the goal. For example, actually reading the word problem itself is a barrier. And it's a barrier to being able to achieve that goal when reading isn't a part of that goal, math is. The goal isn't to be able to read, it's to be able to understand the problem, apply addition and subtraction, and then find the answer. So expecting students to read the word problem would be a barrier for so many students, from students with dyslexia, to students who just aren't strong readers yet, to students who have vision disabilities, or language processing disorders, or who aren't native speakers of that language. But if we change how we present the math problem to only sharing the real life problem, we need to make a plan for those students.
Can you switch on the mic because there is no trend?
It is on.
But it's
Should we just switch the mics or?
You can switch the mics, yeah.
so maybe only one mic is working because the interpreter just said that she is not. She doesn't.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'll back up a little tiny bit. But if we change how we present the math problem to only sharing the real life problem verbally, that also presents a barrier, because that presents it for a different group of students, such as those who are deaf, who need to reread something multiple times to make sense of it, who have head colds and just can't hear very well that day. We need to make sure we have a pathway for students who need to hear it verbally, and we need a pathway for students who need to be able to read it visually. So now that we've identified a few different barriers to our learning goal, we can move on to our third step and start to include flexibility and choice that will remove those unnecessary barriers.
We can build that lesson like that adjustable seat so that they have their own ability to make choices about what's gonna work best for them. So in our example, a teacher without a lot of technology in the classroom could say to their class, you can choose to work on the word problem by yourself, or you can work on the problem in a small group where one of your partners will read that problem out loud to you. Or you can work in a center with a teacher who will read that problem out loud to you. And if you do have technology in your classroom, where you have access to tablets, for example, or apps on your phone, you could have the problems both on printed paper and in digital form. And that way, students could use things like text-to-speech tools, plug in headphones, and hear it that way, and then work on the problem, and therefore reading no longer becomes a barrier to them. All students then have the same degree of access to a rigorous problem, and they're all able to achieve their own pathway to solve the actual answer. And this is why we find this definition helpful to teachers who are trying to implement UDL. Because implementing UDL isn't about checking a box or completing a sort of a checklist. It's more like building a muscle. Repeated practice and a habit of how to think about designing your lessons is much more powerful than any set of rules or guidelines. But what Universal Design for Learning is an incredible tool and a toolbox that helps you build that muscle. And that's where the third word, research, comes into play.
And so the research lives in the guidelines that are developed and published by an organization called CAST. And we find that teachers find it very helpful to use the guidelines, not to, again, check the boxes, but to identify what are those possible barriers that we mentioned in step 2, and what are different ways we can create choice and flexibility in our step 3. If you're familiar with the guidelines that are published by CAST, know that this past July they did publish some updates to this. So you may hear us use slightly different language than you've heard before, there's some slightly new bullets. The overall structure is the same. We're going to get into examples of all of this, but one thing I want to do is highlight the way that the guidelines are organized. The guidelines are organized both vertically and horizontally. So vertically, they're designed in these color-coded columns by UDL principle that are connected to the neural networks of the brain. So that's where the neuroscience part comes in. They're also organized horizontally. And they're organized horizontally into 3 rows. The top row is the access row. This is the row that really focuses on ensuring that students have basic access to the activity, to the lesson. Kate's example of if they can't read the word problem, they can't do the math. This makes sure that they understand the word problem before doing the math. It's about basic access. The next row is the support row. The support row is what a lot of basic, really good teaching often looks like. It's providing scaffolds, it's providing support, it's things like graphic organizers. And then the third row is the executive function row, and this is where we ask students to reflect on their own learning, to get metacognitive about their own learning, and develop self-awareness, self-knowledge, and learner agency, which as you can see is the goal of UDL, so that students know what they need to learn in different contexts and feel empowered to make choices in future learning contexts, whether that's the next day in the classroom, whether that's the next year in school, whether that's in a hobby or a career. They understand what they need to learn.
Yeah. Can you go on to the next one? Thank you. All right, for each of the 3 principles, we're going to do a picture activity, where we'll ask you to look at a picture and answer a question connected to a specific part of your brain, connected to one of the neural networks. We'll then explain the connection between that experience and the UDL principle itself, and share some specific UDL examples of what that looks like in a classroom with students. We'll do that cycle 3 times, 1 for each of the principles. And the first one that we are going to start with, one more time, Jean. is the engagement principle. All right, I ask you to look at this image for a minute, and as you look at it, I want you to consider two questions. One, where does your attention linger? And two, what does your eye gravitate towards? Give me just a minute. All right. Now, thinking about what caught your eye, what caught your attention, why do you think your attention lingered where it did? And what about who you are today, right now, might have drawn your eye there? Think about that for just a minute. One person might say, well, I'm a teacher, and as a teacher, my attention was really drawn to the children at the table. Because I'm wondering, are they doing homework? Are they learning? Is one of these people like a teacher or a tutor? Is it their parent? Is the older child helping the younger child? But another person, maybe someone in here who's not associated with education, might look at this and say, well, as a woman, my attention is drawn to this man. It looks like there's tension between this man and this woman. Does he belong there? What is he doing there? Is he interrupting something? What you just activated is called the affective network of the brain. You were presented with a stimulus, this picture. Oh, we're not quite there yet.
Sorry.
And based on your interests, experiences, and identity, your focus and attention were drawn to a specific aspect or part of that image. And everyone has different things, like that teacher or a woman, that's attention grabbing and unique to them for why. I'm losing my paper here. So it governs the why of learning. Governs how learners monitor the internal and external environments to set priorities, to motivate themselves, to engage learning and behavior. And while we all have different affective networks, they're unique to us. Different things are going to motivate us, and different things are going to bore us or frustrate our learning. It governs how we feel about what we're learning. And how we feel about what we're learning grants us different access to the content. It's harder to learn about a topic when we don't care about it, when we're bored by it, and it's so much easier, and I'm sure you found this to be true, when you're really interested in what you're learning.
And so therefore, because we all have different affective networks, different things that interest and motivate us, UDL tells us that we need to give students multiple means of how they engage. And so if we were to think about some examples that we've seen work for some of the teachers we work with in the United States, when we think about the access row, one of the little bullets here is optimize choice and autonomy. A very simple thing that seems almost silly simple is giving students the choice of writing utensil. You can write in a pen, a pencil, a marker, a crayon, a glitter pen. I have seen students that are not interested in work say, oh, but I can write in a glitter pen? That's at least a doorway into interest about the activity. It's not necessarily where I want to stop, but it's a great starting place. Another example is to give students multiple explanations about why an activity might be relevant or interesting. If I'm teaching a lesson about fractions, some of my students will be interested simply because they love math. They feel good at it, they like it. Other students might feel interested in fractions because it connects to a career that they want to do in the future, and so they're motivated by a future goal. Other students might be motivated by something that's interesting to them right now, like how to understand the scoring of a sport they love better, or how much they need to spend to buy the Halloween costume they want to buy. And so finding ways to mention all of these different things throughout a lesson is one way that we can ensure students have choice into what they hook into. So it's not just, you'll need this in the future and everyone is motivated. It's, you can need this in the future, today, tomorrow, or long term. We're going to skip the support examples for this presentation simply because we find it's often what feels most natural to teachers and sort of just good teaching and practices, and for the sake of time to be able to share as many examples as possible. So let's look at some executive function examples for engagement. One thing you could do is ask students to reflect on the strengths they utilize to complete an assignment. That might sound like, okay, now that this assignment is over, what was really interesting to you? What was really boring maybe during this assignment? And what strengths did you use to help yourself get through the boring parts to still be successful? Allowing them to think, okay, what can I do in the future when I'm bored to keep myself motivated throughout? Another example might be to have students chart their own progress and begin to take agency over how they do that, because different ways of charting your progress will be motivating to different students. Some might want to check off the steps they've made, whereas others might want to sort of color in boxes to demonstrate how many learning goals they have mastered.
All right, so we've done engagement, and we are going to do the same picture activity for the representation principle. So we have our picture again, and this time, I want you to consider everything you can see in the picture. I want you to make a short list. You can write it down, you can take some notes in your phone, you can just hold it in your brain, but I want you to try to list everything you see, and I'll give you a minute to do that. Your list might have looked something like this. A chair, some picture frames, I see a woman, I see a man, I see children, I see people in the background, I see a table, I see dresses, I see a window, I see a piano. It might have contained some of these things, it might have contained other things. But the way you interpret different objects or people is based on your background knowledge, your experiences, your identity, and so much more. For the sake of this activity, I want to invite you to specifically consider either the table or the window, and I want you to answer one more question. How do you know there's a table or a window in this image? Just think about that for a minute. How do you know? What's striking about the table and the window is you can't actually see them. What we think is a table is completely covered up. And this that we think is a window is mostly out of sight. So some might say, well, this white space over here in the corner, I think that's a tablecloth. And I think it's a tablecloth because the way it drapes. And there's a child sitting there, and the way their torso is positioned above the table, I see their feet below, I see them leaning, I think that's a table. And someone might say for the window, well, there's this light edge on the left of the image, and there's a small corner like a picture frame, but then there are these slats that make me think of window panes. And the light source in the picture is coming from that direction. So I think that's a window, but we don't actually see it. So what you just activated is called your recognition network. The photo is fuzzy, it has grid lines, it's gray and white, it's a historical subject that nobody here probably has familiarity with, but you're still able to recognize objects in the in the picture, even when they're not directly depicted. But the way you recognize it draws on different strategies, and that's based on who you are. The recognition networks govern the what of learning. It enables you to recognize, identify, and interpret your senses, including sight, sounds, tastes, smells, and touches. When you hear someone you know talking in another room, but you can't see them yet, and you're able to recognize them, that's your recognition network. When a word is written sideways or upside down, and you're still able to read it, that's your recognition network, as is all of reading in general. Each of our recognition networks is different from the people around us because we all have a different set of things stored away in our brain as prior knowledge, and we all have a different set of sensory strengths and weaknesses. One person's vision might be stronger, one person's hearing might be stronger, etc.
And so, because each of our recognition networks work differently, UDL tells us we need to design for multiple means of representation, multiple ways that students perceive and take in information. And so in the access row, an example might be when you are giving directions to students, make sure you're representing that information in those directions both visually and verbally. So that might look like putting the written directions on the board and reading them aloud. It might look like giving a checklist to each student and then acting out that checklist so they can imagine what it looks like. We can do this so that our students that really are strong at visual processing, but maybe can't hear as well, or have other reasons why like reading is going to be best, they can kind of tune out what we're saying, but they can still understand what's written. Or our students who can't read as well, have dyslexia, have a vision impairment, just process information better by listening, can focus on listening to us. Even if they're looking out the window or looking somewhere else, they can process that information. And many students will do best when they can integrate both. So simply by both visually and verbally sharing directions, we're creating more flexibility for students to tune into what works best for them. Another example is if you are sharing information with students digitally, if they're accessing something on a tablet or a computer, you can share a version with them so that they can edit it themselves. If they need to enlarge the font or change the color contrast, they're able to do that on an individual copy for themselves. Again, we'll skip the support row and we'll look at examples for the executive function row. You can ask students to use previously learned skills to solve new and unfamiliar problems. If you know that students have learned how to annotate the text in the literature course, you can ask them, okay, in this history text, how would you annotate it? If they're learning to take a test, how would you annotate the test question? And ask them to start to recognize, how did you know that it might be helpful to annotate here? What are previous skills that you know that you can use in new contexts to help sort of maximize transfer and generalization of skills? Another example is to offer multiple different opportunities, both in an individual lesson or over the course of a unit, to revisit key ideas and connections. So if I'm asking them to remember something they previously learned and how it relates to this lesson, I might be able to connect to different ideas over the course of a unit or over the course of a lesson so that students that don't remember that thing as well, oh, but I do remember this. So they're able to start to recognize patterns in ways that work best for them.
All right, we're going to return to our picture activity one more time, this one for the action and expression principle. And my question for you this time is, what type of a room is this? So take a minute to think that over. And now consider, how do you know? And what thinking did you do to arrive at your answer? Think about that. How did you know what type of a room it was? The strategies you use to solve problems are unique to you. So one person might say something like, I think it's a parlor. It reminds me of reading a Jane Austen book. This could be a room where maybe they greet visitors, maybe they're doing some work. But another person might look at this and say, no, that's a living room to me. There's pictures on the wall, there's a piano, there's an armchair. I think this is where the family goes to hang out and be together. There's many other answers that people might give here as well. For the teacher earlier who thought that might be students at a table doing homework, they might think this is another room altogether. So there's many reasonable ways to answer the question, and everyone is going to have a slightly different strategy for how they arrive there. Again, based off your lived experiences, your prior knowledge, and your approach to problem solving. So what you just activated when you did this is the strategic network of the brain. You were given a problem to identify the type of room, and you needed a strategy to answer it. And you may not have processed it as a strategy. You probably just came up with your answer, but your brain still used a strategy to get there. You may have oriented to the furniture in the room. You may have been looking at the types of activities people did to come up with your answer, or how they were interacting with each other. The strategic network governs the how of learning. It governs our ability to plan and perform tasks like tying our shoes, driving our car, completing a complex project. Anytime you're posed with doing something, you end up developing a strategy to do that, whether you do it consciously or not. It governs our ability to identify and set a goal, big or small, and then develop a way to get there, monitor on progress, and adjust our strategy if it's not working for us. We all have them, but each of our strategic networks is wired differently because we've all developed different sets of proficiencies based off the strategies that have worked for us over time. It's informed by our culture, by our personality, by the opportunities we've had, and our neurobiology.
And so because we all have strategic networks, but they all work differently, UDL tells us that we need to give students multiple means of action and expression. In other words, multiple ways to complete an assignment, to practice, or to demonstrate their learning on an assessment. So in our access row, again, another example about how to give students access to writing, but this time thinking about what they physically need. So we could give students a choice for how to write. Some students might struggle with pencil grip or with fine motor skills, and actually writing in pen or paper could be physically painful to them. What other choices might they have? Could we allow them to type? Could we allow them to use their phone to use text to, or speech to text and speak into their phone and allow technology to type it for them? Other students might not be able to speak their thoughts very well and really need that pencil and paper to get their thinking going. So ensuring students that have access for how they physically write information can be one way to ensure that students have access to writing. Another example might be to create flexibility in the design of the physical space. If you have students who have gross motor skill difficulties, or students in wheelchairs, or students who are on crutches temporarily, designing the classroom in a way that they can move through that classroom without bumping into things is going to be important to them. Students who have sound sensitivity, allowing them to wear headphones or listen to music while they're working can allow them to help focus. Also, giving them a choice of where they sit. Some students work really well with others, and some students really need some alone time to do that work. And so giving them a choice. You can sit with a friend to do this work, or you can sit by yourself. When we think about the executive function examples, we can ask students to reflect on the strategies they chose and recognize their progress or lack thereof. So in that example I just shared, hey, you can choose to work with a friend or a group, or you can work by yourself. Give them 5 to 10 minutes to work and then interrupt them and say, all right, let's pause for a moment. If you are working with a group, is that really helping you? Or is it distracting you? Or are you just talking with your friends? If you are working alone, is that really helping you? Or are you kind of lost and you want to be able to talk with people about this learning? Which one works best for you? And do you want to change your choice right now? If you're working in a group, do you want to leave and sit by yourself? If you're sitting by yourself, do you want to join a group? We can also use prompts to support students in anticipating challenge and encourage their strategic planning. If students are working on a research report, you can ask them in advance and ask them throughout the process. What do you anticipate is going to be easy? What do you anticipate is going to be hard? How much time do you think that's going to take? How is it going? You thought it was going to take 10 minutes to do this. Did it really take 10 minutes? How much time do you think you'll need in the future? And so as we sort of wrap up our discussion of the 3 principles and examples we've seen work really well for teachers to get started, I want to just come back to this idea of why we do the picture activity is because we often see teachers get caught up in the little bullet points. What does it mean to do this? What does it mean to do this? Am I doing it right? And when we think about the idea that all of us in this room, all of us in wherever we've done this activity, have different things that interest them for different reasons, recognize different items, and have different ways of figuring out a name for the room. Same thing with our students. Different things will interest them, different things they'll be able to perceive, and different strategies they'll use. And so how can we create flexibility and choice in those 3 ways and thinking about possible barriers that exist? we want to sort of conclude that section with saying, with sharing a quote from Louis Lord Nelson, that UDL has taught us that it is the environment, not the student, that needs to change. And so UDL helps us think about, I don't need to fix a student who's not learning, I need to teach this environment so my students will learn.
All right, so we have shared a lot of quick examples as we went through the picture activity and through the guidelines, but now we're going to walk through a longer example with our 3-step process in mind. And as we start this more extended example, I am going to just remind us of why we tell the architecture story. So as you remember, both architects started with the goal of having an art museum, and one jumped immediately into the design process and had to think about the diversity of the people who'd be visiting after the fact. Whereas the other one started with the people. Who were all the possible visitors who were going to come to this museum, and how could they then approach design in a way where all of them would be able to visit? That's the mindset shift that will have the biggest impact on our ability to actually implement universal design for learning successfully. Start by imagining all the possible needs students can have. So in order to develop the habit of implementing UDL, we recommend this 3-step process. First, starting with a clear, rigorous learning goal. Next, imagining who all the learners are and what possible barriers exist for the learners to achieve the goal. And then 3, planning the lesson in a way that optimizes choice and flexibility to remove those barriers. So let's talk through an example. A common goal in a humanities classroom is for students to read and analyze a grade level text. The text could be a novel, it could be a poem, it could be a historical document or a nonfiction essay. But the students need to analyze the text's themes, possibly the characters, and the author's purpose. So as a teacher, let's first get really clear on what's relevant to our learning goal and what's not. For example, in this goal, is it about silently decoding the text independently? Is it about the student's phonetic ability to read each word? Or is it about comprehending and analyzing the text? Our intuition might be that it's about all of them. It's about reading. But in this case, it's about the last one. It's just about comprehending and analyzing the text, not about our ability to decode each word. So now that we're really clear on the goal, we're going to move on to identify all the possible barriers to students to achieve that goal. For example, any number of students might struggle to independently decode the text due to dyslexia, due to being blind or having a vision impairment, due to having a lack of quality reading instruction before this year, or having a preference for listening comprehension over written comprehension, or even just having a temporary health issue, like having a migraine that day, which impairs their vision. So if I were to pick an easier, below grade level text for those struggling readers, one, it's not going to actually get them to the rigorous goal, because it's going to now be below grade level, and my goal is to have all of them meet that same goal. So I need to find a better way to go about it. Which means, if I can turn the page to the next one, I am now going to look at my lesson planning and think about what I can do now. And to do that, I'm going to go to the UDL guidelines, recognizing that all of the barriers were related to how students could perceive the information in the text. So I'm looking at the guidelines to think about, okay, how can I offer them choices in perception? I see that there are recommendations there, and I'm looking at the bullet point that's right there in the middle that talks about multiple ways to perceive information. I'm going to think about ensuring that students have the text between visually reading the text or listening to it out loud. When I plan my lesson, I can write in directions and make sure I have materials so that students can choose. I can have them read the text quietly by themselves, or I can tell them they can listen to the text out loud. If I have access to an audiobook, I can allow them to access that independently, or I can record myself in advance so they can listen to me read the text out loud to them. I can also make sure the tablets have access to a version that's compatible with text to speech, so it can read it directly out loud to them. And if I don't have that kind of technology in my classroom, because we don't always have access to technology in our classrooms, I can just invite the students who'd like to hear the text out loud to join me in a corner of the classroom, so that I'm not disrupting the students who are able to just dig in right away, but everyone still has access in the same goal. Now, I've done that, and all students are reading the same grade level text and are engaging in the same rigorous analysis, but they have different pathways into how they can access that information. And if I'm just getting started with UDL, if this is like my first day in the classroom with UDL, this might be where I stop, right? I need to teach my students how to access the audiobook. I'm trying to struggle with all of these things. This might be all I do on that first day. But if my students have already had some practice with choice, like if they already know how to use an audiobook, if they already know how to use text-to-speech, maybe I'm ready to extend my practice. So at this point, I can return to the guidelines and return to my thinking about all of the barriers that might be in place to prevent my students from reaching the goal, and I can consider other guidelines. Sorry, I'm having this difficulty with my finger. There we go. For example, now that all students can access reading the text at a basic level, there may be barriers to students understanding what they're reading or hearing, such as challenging vocabulary, students who are reading in their non-native language, or students who struggle to monitor comprehension and need to use a strategy to help when they're feeling stuck. And so I can think about strategies from the support row of UDL, specifically from this one about language and symbols, such as pre-teaching some vocabulary from the text to the whole class, and ensuring the information is written somewhere that they can go back and easily remind themselves of the information. I can also think about strategies in the executive function row, specifically around building knowledge, such as asking them to connect to their prior learning, either something we previously learned in class, or even something they would have learned outside of class. For example, if I'm asking them to read a novel with themes of betrayal, I might ask them to connect it to a novel I know they read the previous year, but I also might ask them to think about a popular TV show where a character has just committed betrayal, so that they're able to have multiple access points into that and think about betrayal in multiple ways. Some students are going to just naturally connect more to the TV show that everyone's been watching and talking about, and some students are actually going to connect more with the novel that they read last year because they enjoyed it. I can give students tools like graphic organizers, teach them how to use the graphic organizers for the text that they're working with, and then keep checking in with them, having them reflect on their learning and say, is this graphic organizer a strategy that I'm actually finding useful in this moment? So, as a reminder, we're not ever thinking about the guidelines as a checklist, because we're never going to meet every single one of these things for any particular lesson. That's never going to be appropriate. But we do want to think about it as a tool to support ourselves in thinking about how to create that choice and flexibility in our classrooms by removing those barriers. And in this way, we can ensure that our students are not only reaching rigorous goals, but they're also developing agency as learners so that they're able to know in the future, this is a strategy that works for me. This is a topic I'm not interested in, and so I need to find a different way to be engaged in this, and et cetera, et cetera.
Okay. So, one of the things that UDL calls on us to do is to recognize that in many contexts we have a notion that there's a right or best way to learn, and to start to do some of our own mindset checking around unlearning some of those expectations. I know in our experience, often in the United States, there is sort of an unspoken expectation that the best, the smartest, the right way to read is silent decoding, and that listening to an audiobook is lesser than. But we believe that that's not necessarily true. Listening is just as valid of a way to access a text and to think about information as silently reading it. And so I want to engage in a little game of pretend with you all for a moment to think about this idea. I want you to pretend, let's just pretend, that after this presentation is over, we're going to give you all a test of how much you learned about UDL. And like the good teacher I am, I'm going to share with you the rubric of my expectations for your test. So on our pretend rubric, the pretend test I'm not going to give you, this is my rubric of how I'm going to assess your understanding of UDL. There's a lot of text in here. I'm going to read the column 3 aloud. I'm assessing you in 3 different domains, a 3-point rubric for each one. The first domain is organization in your argument, knowledge and understanding, and style and technique. To get full credit in organization and argument, you need to write and record an original opera song that provides a thorough main idea supported by details. To get full credit in knowledge and understanding, in that opera song, you need to express comprehensive explanation of UDL, how it supports variability, and provide some examples. And to get full credit under style and technique, you need to use an effective variety of both classical and modern operatic techniques and effective musical notation that enhances your operatic style. Now my question for you is, how do you feel when you see that? If this were really a test I was going to give you, how would your body be reacting? Stressful. It raises my heart rate just sharing an example. And my other question for you is, would this be an accurate measure of your learning? My guess is for most of you, probably not. Probably not. Very few of us, I'm going to guess. Give me one moment. Based on your experiences, based on your skills, based on what you've learned, for many of us in this room, and for possibly all of us in this room, writing an opera is not the best way that we're going to express our learning. It also has nothing to do with our learning goals about UDL today. There may be some people for whom that will work for them. They love opera, they are they write music, they compose music, they might get really excited, like finally a chance for me to shine, for me to demonstrate my true learning. But for many of us, that's not going to be true. Even if we compose music, we might not be very skilled at opera. Even if we're familiar with opera, we might not ever compose it. So instead, let's pretend I changed my rubric. And now my rubric simply says, compose a response that provides a thorough main idea. The knowledge of UDL stays the same. And in my second technique, I say, effective use of the techniques of your chosen medium to enhance the content and ideas. Now, you could still write an opera song if that is your favorite thing. You could write an essay. You could say, I want to take a multiple choice test, and they could give you one. You could say, I want to put together a poster presentation. You could orally explain it to me or put together an oral presentation for the class. You could record a TikTok style video. Any number of opportunities are now available to you to demonstrate your learning about UDL. So when I share that idea, now think about, how do you feel now? And would this be an accurate measure of your learning? I ask this question because frequently, writing an opera is equivalent for many students to taking a test. Taking a test is frequently not the best way. Many students can demonstrate their learning, whether it's a multiple choice test or a written response. We won't actually be able to see our students' true ability, but if I were to use a rubric like this to learn their skills, so many students would be able to demonstrate a very high level of learning that they might not on a test. Now, when we share this idea, back up. When I allow, this also connects to the idea of using multiple media for communication. How can students communicate their learning, their ideas, in multiple different ways? It also connects to the idea of using multiple tools for construction, composition, and creativity. And we can teach them the skills of how to do these things so that they have the skills to be able to compose in different ways. We can teach them how to record a video. We can teach them the idea of the poster presentation so that then when we give them that choice, they actually understand, okay, I know what works for me. I know which one I'm going to choose because I have skills in multiple different media. Now, when we share this idea, we often get asked, okay, but what about tests? Aren't tests important? And we think they are. There's absolutely a place for tests in a world that uses UDL. What we'll often sometimes say is, if there's time, do both. Give a test, because we know students need to learn how to take tests. Tests are a gatekeeper to many opportunities. To get into the school you want to go to, you might have to take a test. To get into the career you want to, you might have to take a test. To get a certification or a license in your career, you might have to take a test. Students need practice with tests. But maybe give a test and also give an assignment with a rubric like the one I just shared. When there's time, allow students both, because then students that do demonstrate their learning best on tests have that opportunity, and you're going to learn a lot more about what all the other students that maybe don't demonstrate their learning best on tests actually know. And when I say that tests are important, it's also this idea of building fluencies with graduated support for practice and performance. Teach students how to take tests, just as you would teach them how to write an essay, so that they have skills for multiple different media that we want them to use.
Thanks.
In conclusion,
so as we come to a close, we want to invite you to remember the words of Louis Lord Nelson that we shared earlier today, which is that UDL has taught us that it is the environment, not the student, that needs to change. UDL helps us to shift our focus from fixing students to fixing our lesson so that all students can learn. But building new habits is hard. Think about all the times you've tried to build a new habit. What's been hard about it, and what have you done to be successful? I'll share a personal example. For years, I have tried to build a habit of running multiple times a week. And I inevitably always fail. I set it as a New Year's resolution, I try for about a month, and then I just give up. And it's because I often set my expectation too high. I will think to myself, okay, I'm gonna start running 20 minutes 3 times a week. And I think I'm going to somehow achieve that in the first week when I haven't been running at all previously. And it's hard, and I don't like sweating, and by the end of a couple of weeks, I just inevitably give up. I talk myself out of it, and I say, I'll try again at some other point in time. And I just keep repeating and keep failing. But when I really sat down to think about what it would take to build a new habit, and I got really granular with it and gave myself small goals. I set out and said, okay, I'm already walking every day. I'm taking my little mental health walks every single day. Let's add in a couple of minutes of jogging into that daily walk, just a couple of minutes. And once I got good at doing that couple of minutes jogging a couple of times a week, I said, okay, make it a few more minutes. Let's get up to 5, then let's get up to 10, get up to 20, and so forth. And now I can actually do that. But it took a plan, and it took me reflecting along the way and checking in with my body. How did this feel? Did it feel better before you started jogging, or does it feel better now? How is it affecting the rest of your day? Really, doing all of that then helps me build it into a habit that now I don't want to skip. And the same is true of UDL. It takes planning and commitment and reflection. It's a habit and a muscle, much more than it is a checklist. So thinking about how you've built habits in the past, what do you need to do in order to be successful as an educator to successfully build it as a habit in your practice? And this is what we recommend. If you're just getting started with UDL, you've already learned a lot about the big ideas, we've shared lots of examples with you, but maybe you're still not sure, okay, great, but where exactly would I start in my classroom? Take comfort that just jumping in the deep dive is the deep end of UDL is not going to be successful for you, and it's not going to be great for your kids either. We want you to sort of start out slow here. So we recommend at the beginning of the year, starting out small, and starting with the access row. Maybe some of the support row functions if you're already doing that as part of your teaching. So with the example of using, for example, audio formats or print formats in classrooms, maybe what you do is, the first thing you do is teach students how to use audiobooks. Maybe they haven't done that before. Or you teach them how to use text-to-speech tools. So you spend a couple of lessons just doing that, like making sure they know how to use all of the choices in front of them, And then you start presenting those as options every time. Give yourself practice, give them practice. And that way, they know when you give them the choice, they know how to use it to support their learning, and they start to learn, does that work for them? Which one works for them? Does it work for them on certain days and not other days? Then after a month or two, go ahead and take on another couple of guidelines. Start maybe doing some more things from the support row, and then think really more broadly about barriers. Start to ask students to reflect on how different tools help them. Do they hold them back? Do they really support them in the class? And very importantly, how do they know it works for them? Then maybe towards the middle to the end of the year, as you keep adding on, start to also think about learner agency. Ask students to make choices for themselves and to identify when they want to use something different and allow them to do so. And ask them to also think about when a different situation might require a different strategy. And then finally, over the summer, reflect, reflect, reflect. What worked for you? What expectations do you still maybe need to unlearn? After all, none of us were taught with universal design for learning in mind, which means we all have sort of set habits already. What worked for your students, and what do you think you could improve?
I want to end by noting that because of this idea of learner variability, that no two learners are the same, that UDL supports all learners to thrive and to develop agency as learners so that they can be lifelong learners, have access to new opportunities. Because we know when we design for the average student, we're designing for no one. And we also want to acknowledge that while UDL is powerful for all learners and important for all learners, it can be especially powerful for students who don't learn within the dominant culture of the learning environment. So by that, I mean that includes students with disabilities, students who are non-native speakers of the language used in instruction, students with trauma. Any number of students that typically sit on the margins will be especially supported by UDL. When we think about this, and we think about the example we mentioned multiple times of giving students access to the print text or to an audio format, if we make that just the norm, hey, anyone can choose between these two choices, then we've actually sort of blurred the idea that the margins even exist. All students have already been planned for in this classroom, and we've said these pathways are both valid, valuable, and important in our room. And so, as a result of the fact that this is just a normal way to learn in our classroom, all students learn that there is no right way to learn. Instead, multiple different ways of learning are equally valid and equally valuable and valued. And this creates a more inclusive society. Thank you.
Thank you so much for spending your time with us today. We really appreciate